Transition and Climate Action Strategy, which is the second in a series of 4 funder briefings hosted by the Climate Justice Alliance. Today we'll be hearing from 5 organizers and community leaders on how just transition principles, strategies, and practices of frontline communities provide systemic solutions for the planet. My name is Caitlin Duffy, and I work with the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy as our Senior Associate for Learning and Engagement and our Organizational Liaison for Environmental and Climate Justice. NCRP is honored to serve as one of the co-sponsors for today's funder briefing alongside the Convita Fund, the Just Transition Fund, the Solutions Project, and the Wallace Global Fund, which has generously provided this space for those of us that are here in DC, so thank you. Before we get started, I'll note that today we're asking for questions to be saved until the end of the presentation. For those of us who are joining us on Zoom, please use the chat function to submit your questions. And if you'd like to join me on Twitter during the conversation, you can tag the Climate Justice Alliance at CJAOurPower. And you can also use the hashtag JustTransition, and it takes root. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ananda.
Thanks. My name is Ananda Lee. Should I just continue or?
No, because you're disconnected.
Go to the Bluetooth menu on your mobile device and connect to Jabra Speak 510.
So make sure you pick it up from.
Hi, thanks, Caitlin. My name is Ananda Litan. I'm an organizer with the Climate Justice Alliance, which is the largest national grassroots organizing formation working on climate change in the US, a formation rooted in communities on the front lines of this intertwined ecological, economic, and social justice crises, a crisis that has been born out of not only the storms, the floods, the droughts, and the fires that have come to symbolize climate change, but also the root causes of this ecological crisis, the very industries, the dig, burn, drive, dump industries causing this crisis. Our communities are indigenous communities, African-American communities, Latino, Asian Pacific Islander, and working class white communities, communities that are first and most impacted by these storms, floods, and droughts, and forest fires, but also communities that are at the forefront of cultivating real solutions to address this ecological and economic crises. Communities that are both fighting the industries, the coal power plants, the incinerators, the toxic landfill sites, the chemical industries that are at the root of this crisis, and the economic systems that perpetuate them, but also folks that are figuring out pathways that to build an economy rooted in the needs of these communities and the workers that represent our communities in these industries. Now, our climate justice platform was born out of an older movement, an environmental justice movement. And as part of our tradition, we like to really recognize both the work that has been done before us, but those that have really been responsible for provisioning the pathways forward. We really believe that in order to figure out what are the most effective, durable, and strategic paths that lead us out of this crisis, we need to rely on some of the place-based knowledge and wisdom that has been cultivated locally in these communities by many of our elders and past previous generations. And with that, actually, is a perfect segue to turn it over to a brother and comrade, someone who represents one of our earliest efforts in really bridging the discourse between our frontline communities and the workers whom we need to build a new economy with. And someone who I have deep respect for, who's provided us not only a lot of thought leadership, but also who has been effectively facilitated the conversation amongst very powerful bases, something that's very difficult to do, given that sometimes we're on opposite sides of the debate. But with no further ado, I'm honored to be sitting next to my brother, Jose Bravo.
Well, thank you for that introduction. I hope I can live up to it. With my presentation, I wanted to talk to folks around the history of just transition. First of all, the history of just transition comes out of an alliance between the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union and 5 networks throughout the United States, where the workers had a lot of health and safety issues, a lot of issues with security around explosions and other things to that nature. And they had made a collaboration with Mainstream Greens, but Mainstream Greens were mostly in the business of shutting those operations down instead of having them transition into something that makes sense. So labor reaches out to an environmental justice movement. And why the environmental justice movement? Because as we have a discussion around the dangers inside chemical and energy plants, you know, the only thing that separates communities of color and low-income communities in the United States is a chain link fence. In many instances, because of the weak and substandard type of zoning regulation, communities of color and low-income communities butt right up to heavy industry. And we see that at a national level. And when we started bringing forth the environmental justice movement way back in 1991, that was apparent, and it still is. It hasn't gone away. So part of that, the reason for that is, again, we believe that there is race-based zoning that puts people of color and low income also in harm's way. And there's also what we call selective enforcement. When federal agencies, even state or local agencies, go after some of these polluters, we know that fines are lesser in communities of color and lower income communities than they are in white, more privileged communities. So we have to talk about a just transition, transitioning out of a fossil fuel economy into something that makes sense for the communities and the planet as well. But we can't transition without also addressing the issue of legacy, the legacy contamination left behind in these communities by some of those industries that have been around for many, many years. I will give you a case example. If you look at Navajo land, you know, there's over 1,500 uranium mines that are inactive, but are still very much contaminating and causing severe harm to both humans, or native people in this case, and the environment. So I think it's super important for us to look at the legacy of energy as well, and not just think about how do we transition into something new without addressing some of that legacy and that. So on to what we call resiliency, right? So resiliency has several meanings, right? For us, in the environmental justice community, resiliency could be how to weather the storm, basically. How are we going to weather the next storm, the next natural or unnatural happening in our community, and how we link that to climate. We've known for years, since the first People of Color Summit, when the people from the Marshall Islands came to us here in Washington, D.C., and talked to us about them being targeted for nuclear bombs in the Bikini Atolls and other things like that. And they were also very concerned around the sea level rise and the fact that they were losing indigenous lands. And in many cases, they were losing lands that they hold near and dear because they, you know, a lot of their ancestors were buried on those lands, and they're becoming, they're going underwater. So again, I think that the impact on people of color from climate is very apparent. When we talk about high indices of asthma, we know that in African American and Latino communities are the highest indices of asthma, and we believe that to be because of heat and industry and many other things that correlate with the issue of climate. I'll talk a little bit about the Conference of the Parties, or what is called the COP process within the UN. For us, for many of us, the conference of the party has turned into a conference on fall solutions. It brings together ideas and or tries to institutionalize processes that, again, will put most of the impact on the global south while leaving the global north to emit at the same level or actually increase levels of emissions. So it does not make sense for us to follow suit with what happens within the COP. So it's really important that organizations like GGGA, CJA, and others that have been sending delegations there and the Indigenous Environmental Network get a fair seat at the table where people can see that there are communities that are already being impacted by some of those fall solutions, like the RED process within the UN. The numbers don't match up for us. You know, we're talking about even coming out of France with a 2 degrees rise in Celsius temperature. Those numbers, as we had said before, in the climate justice principle, will cook us, will cook our planet, and will add more impact to those communities that are already over impacted and under resourced and the such. So we feel that there needs to be a change in philanthropy. We feel that there needs to be a change towards addressing the need grassroots, which is building equity and alignment. And, you know, one of the relationships that we formed, to give you an example, with the Green Group, with NRDC, we had NRDC write a letter to MacArthur. So Ria Sue wrote a letter to MacArthur and said, hey, we thank you for our share of the $50 million down payment, but even our lofty ideas won't materialize unless we fund the grassroots as well, right? Because without funding the grassroots, it's going to be difficult unless we just focus on fall solutions. I believe that's me saying that. So I think that climate policies moving forward have to include every level of impact, from sourcing locally to having regional and local economies to joining in a fight to address climate issues, joining with labor, joining with non-organized community workers as well, and non-affiliated organizations of workers as well. But joining in a way that we respect each other, and as workers and communities of color and environmental justice communities, we move these issues forward together. So I want to announce that the B Initiative will be hosting a Just Transition Forum on February 16th through the 1st. I was almost going to say 29th, but February doesn't have 29 days this year. To the 1st in Jackson, Mississippi. And we want to announce that because ultimately we're bringing key players to that table. Labor and ourselves and green groups and philanthropy. And I think it's important for folks to have that on their radar. And I also want to invite funders to join the B, the Building Equity and Alignment. You know, through the B, our goal is to fund the grassroots and also bring alignment in the different sectors that we believe are only this far away from aligning on a lot of issues, but now we're starting to talk to each other and making sure that that happens. So thank you very much. And next, I want to introduce Diana Lopez. She is the Executive Director of the Southwest Organizing Project. Sorry, Southwest Workers Union. I'm so sorry. Southwest Workers Union. And we at the Just Transition Alliance have worked with SWU for about probably over 17 years. We worked with them on the Kelly Air Force Base, the shutdown of the Kelly Air Force Base and the contamination on site and the health concerns and health issues of the communities next door. So take it away with Sue.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you for having me here. It's good to be talking and being in the same space with you all. So Southwest Workers Union, we are 30 years old next year on May 1st, and we are in our third transition of leadership in the organization. Right here. And so part of our work is really a continuation of some of our earliest values. Some of our members include public school workers, domestic workers, youth, and fence-line neighborhoods. One of them mentioned by Jose around the Kelly Air Force Base, which is the neighborhood where I come out of. People directly affected by the industrial contamination there in San Antonio. And we have been part of this group and these people for a very long time, developing grassroots global justice and the Climate Justice Alliance and various other networks that really uplift organizations on the ground. And regionally, Texas is a very large place, and the context which we live in are very difficult, which I'll go over in the next slide. But we serve as a movement hub, hosting different meetings, facilitation in different spaces where people could come together and really talk about some of the issues in a safe space, in a bilingual space, in an intergenerational space, and really kind of build and dream together, which is really important for us. And so, I saw, yes. And so, welcome to South Texas. That is where we live in. That's the context which we work in. And for us, the challenges really go back to a legacy of segregation and structural barriers that have really produced a system of exclusion, of unequal opportunity, and blighted neighborhoods suffering from the lack of public investment in infrastructure. And so the failure to address these root causes have really led to these challenges, and particularly band-aid approaches to public goods and services have really burdened communities rather than supported them. And so oftentimes they perpetuate poverty, financial insecurity, low educational attainment, poor health, and deep, long entrenched problems in the criminal justice sector. And so it's within this context that climate change is playing out, that immigration reform is playing out, that is why San Antonio is one of the largest cities with economic segregation and the recent votes around the privatization of water and gentrification. And so we see these as not only one specific problem, but part of a larger historical entrenched issues for our community. And so some of these pieces include here's some examples of sort of the developing connections between climate change and workers' rights. And so we see this through our work with immigration and how that is oftentimes overlapped and how undocumented residents can be affected by some of these issues. And so this year we saw one of the worst anti-immigration, anti-worker bills that came to us, which really caused a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety within our members. Some of them had to go back to their countries because they refused to just live in a space like that. And so that's what we have to deal with on the ground, is sort of addressing the need to build community together and to create safe spaces for our communities. And so that's where SWU kind of flourishes in having our own space where we are facilitating and directing and building healing spaces and community spaces that are organized and that are embedded in undocumented workers, in community workers, in women. And so this is an example of some of the models that we've developed in our 30 years, whereas our current context is we just went over, and using these 4 different sections, community organizing, focusing on the worker, focusing on the youth, focusing on popular education is really critical to, and the base of all of our work. And changing public policy is part of that structure as well. It's not one or the other, it's both of those together. And incorporating and increasing accountable governance, which means how do we hold our elected officials accountable? How do we get our members and those who are embedded and on the fence line into the school districts to really change and be the architects of policy rather than just the objects. And so and finally, one of the larger ones and newer proactive approaches that we've done probably in the past 10 years has been around building new systems, is envisioning what does our community need, not what does it want, but what does it need to survive. And so part of that is where our end goes is how do we create a flourishing food system that's going to be embedded in local economies, that's going to nurture new jobs, that's going to build new leaders, and that is in a really anti-capitalist model, right? Because we don't want to go in the same systems, because we know there are root causes to why we are in this position, and we want to be able to make that clear that racism, that capitalism, that a gender lens is important to be part of those conversations, and we cannot advance in an honest, just way without having those conversations in a good way. And so part of the ways that we did this is some of our history with the neighborhood, and we've seen this model and we've nurtured this model, we've grown this model throughout the years. One of our biggest ones is around environmental justice and the Kelly Air Force Base and the transition, which is if you see in 1994, this campaign actually started, and it continued to grow. All right, so it wasn't just lasting and that same thing, but over these almost 20 years, this campaign grew and it attained something that was very powerful for that community, which was developing a plan to stop the contamination, not just clean up, but stop the continuation of contamination. And so these are some of the other models that we used around rerouting Union Pacific, around the stopping nuclear plants and coal plants from being built, and defeating storage tanks as well. And so this work with energy, because it was connected, because the Port San Antonio was moving forward with their plans to convert into a fracking hub, it was important for us to do this energy work. And so this actually set the basis for a sustainability plan for the Office of Sustainability for the city to invest in some of the renewable systems. And so we plan to continue to strengthen our work around organizing, because we feel this is a really important sector, and uplifting workers' rights in a state that workers are virtually invisible. And so that's extremely important, is aligning with other labor groups, building cooperative economies, political education, and talking about living wages. Some of the ways that we do this, and I'll run through this a little bit quicker, is through political analysis. We have an organizing school with our youth. This is our leadership development process, which we go from planning and understanding the issue and the pipeline of policy to teaching and learning and sharing, to actually being face-to-face with those that are making the policies and the decisions for our community. And so that's important for us is the accountable governance pieces. And so another form is through town halls. So it's extremely important for us to build movement assemblies and town halls and spaces where people could come together. And of course, direct action, because that's important to be visual out in the streets, out sharing our art and our culture and our song and dance. This is in DC earlier this year, art and culture, and through the development of creative toolkits to increase popular education in our community. And so another thing that is not as much mentioned, but very much embedded is some of the civic engagement work. So in order for us to be part of a process, first we have to be counted. And so the census and redistricting work is part of our work that we do, as well as to get out the vote to make sure that our folks are being counted in a right way, that to ensure that undocumented residents are counted and are part of the process, even though they don't have a vote, but are very much part of a community and are affected. And movement building. I think this one is very, very strong, and we'll hear this over and over again, that coming together and that sharing our stories is extremely important into building a larger, stronger movement. And so this is a plan of our Just Transition Plan, and I'll leave it up so that folks can come back to it. But we are under construction right now, and this plan goes for 10 years. And so we are slowly rebuilding and creating a space that's going to harbor some of the ideas that we want and that we want to grow out of. And some of those, and the main avenue that we see some of this work is through a climate action, which is the follow-up of the sustainability plan. And so this is a picture of our office space and our buildings and the kitchen gray water system. And with that, I end my presentation and just want to say thank you to everybody and pass it on to Rosa Gonzalez from the Movement Strategy Center, who will be talking a little bit more about their work.
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
We can, Rosa.
Yes, we can. Rosa, you put yourself on mute. Rosa, you're on mute.
Okay, I'm unmuted and I'm sharing my screen. And here we go, slideshow. And I'm going to select.
You can go ahead and hit play from the start.
Play from start. Okay, great. Thank you.
And, yeah.
Great. Awesome. Thank you for bearing with me on that. I'm really happy to be here with everyone, especially in this chaotic moment that we're in our country and in the planet. And the thing about chaos is that it brings a lot of clarity. And so I'm just appreciating the clarity around this table, that what we need right now are deep investments in grassroots vision, power, and solutions, and that the grassroots really holds the key to the global impact that's needed now. I'm a fellow at Movement Strategy Center, focusing on the practice and pedagogy of deep democracy. My work's been mainly focused on the climate movement and the ways in which climate justice organizations like SWU are using deep democracy practices to develop, implement, and manage climate solutions. One way to think about deep democracy is the governance of community ownership, and that requires some fundamental shifts that can really only be driven by grassroots groups deeply rooted in impacted communities. And deep democracy is a core element of CJA's Just Transition framework because community ownership is so key to achieving climate justice. Through Movement Strategy Center's work engaging movement leaders in transformative strategy through the Transitions Initiative, and through tracking learnings in the field of climate action and resilience and translating those learnings into practical tools and frameworks, and through our work supporting philanthropy and also technical and governmental partners to make strategic pivots to meet this moment, we've gotten really clear on the importance of resourcing ecosystems that center grassroots leadership. If we're going to effectively meet the crises that we're facing right now, we're going to need to unleash unprecedented capacity in service of bold visions. We're going to need to balance the kinds of uneven power dynamics that have led to the current economic and ecological disasters. And doing that takes resourcing ecosystems with grassroots leadership at the center. Climate impacts are not experienced in isolation, as we know. Anyone living in an impacted community understands that the problems are connected and so are the solutions. And so we need place-based, comprehensive, community-driven solutions. And that requires a range of synergistic capacities like building political power, engaging story-based strategy, developing regenerative financing models, and building multi-stakeholder teams. And so I just want to make the point that I hope is obvious to everyone that the Climate Justice Alliance is a thriving ecosystem. Like Ananda was mentioning, it represents the racial and cultural diversity of the US, as well as every key region in the country. It brings together labor, economic and environmental justice, technical expertise, policy development and advocacy, political and narrative strategy with culturally rooted grassroots organizing capacity. And most importantly to me, CJA is driven by visionary grassroots organizations and frontline communities who are leading local and regional just transition. And this is particularly important in this moment where, you know, the local cities and counties bear an incredible burden to advance climate solutions in the absence of viable strategies at the federal and global levels. We're really clear that effective climate strategies must center local and regional solutions. They are our most viable solutions, both in terms of mitigating greenhouse gas emissions and for building the resiliency of communities to withstand the impacts of the climate crisis. Urban environments account for 75% of all human-produced global greenhouse gas emissions, and they are also where we find the public will to actually reduce emissions. 7,400 cities worldwide have set greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals. New York City, for example, has set a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2020. And it's important to mention that goals like this are often the result of grassroots organizing that has built the political will to do so. If we take a quick look at how New York City's greenhouse gas emissions break down, 73% are from heating and electricity, 21% from transportation. So what's clear is that the work of actually meeting a goal like this requires deep participation on the part of communities in things like shifting to energy efficiency and in building the political will to divest from the fossil fuel industry, in designing transit-oriented development, for example, and other comprehensive solutions. And so this is why foundations like Kresge, Candida, Wallace Global Fund, and others are investing in community capacity for climate action and planning. Movement Strategy Center and some of our partners supported Kresge in the design of their Climate Resilience and Urban Opportunity Initiative, which directly funds grassroots organizations to influence local and regional climate resilience planning and policy development to better reflect the needs and priorities of low-income communities. And this kind of investment is key to helping cities avoid overinvestment in false climate solutions. Without grassroots leadership in the development of climate solutions, we can end up with local adaptation models that contribute to ecological crises, things like desalination plants and seawalls. Or we can end up with mitigation models that exacerbate the impacts of climate change, particularly among low-income communities and communities of color, like changing building codes to reduce emissions in ways that raise housing costs and accelerate displacement. Instead, what we want to accelerate is the implementation of real climate solutions. So we partnered with a number of CJA members like Movement Generation, Poder, the Center for Earth, Energy, and Democracy, APEN, Communities for a Better Environment, UPROS, and others to conduct an inquiry into the range of critical capacities and innovative approaches that grassroots groups bring to the development of climate solutions. And this study turned into a framework for community-driven planning, climate resilience planning that has since been adopted by Kresge and is being taught in a number of planning and ecological design departments. And we formed an association of climate resilience planners to be able to share stories and data and tools that help build and scale the capacity for community-driven planning within communities most impacted by climate crises. One of the biggest pitfalls in conventional planning is developing beautiful plans that just sit on shelves because there's no strategy for resourcing implementation, which is why we emphasize planning for implementation and why grassroots power and solutions are so key. CJA members and support organizations are developing innovative resourcing models that interrupt patterns of inequality and at the same time generate increased capacity to manage climate solutions. So we need cities to help drive the global transition to climate stability, but having cities commit to Paris goals or more ambitious goals won't get us there unless there is a deep investment in the grassroots and the local engines that work to ensure those goals are translated into real action. And those local engines are made up of community vision, power, and solutions development. The boldest visions right now are coming up from the grassroots because it's at the grassroots where there's genuine grappling with how to address the structural root causes of the climate crisis, and where there's the most recognition that you can't solve climate problems without solving economic problems. We need to invest in community organizing and power because that's how we strengthen our democracy. And it's, I'm sure, clear to everyone that when our democracy is broken, it's almost impossible to implement solutions and make the kind of shifts that are needed right now. And finally, when communities design and implement their own solutions from a community organizing approach, they are building much needed leadership capacity to actually manage those solutions. Just give 3 quick examples. First, Uprose in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, a Latino-led organization with over 50 years of organizing in the community. This is who the community turned to in the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy, not just for immediate emergency response, but to develop a bold vision and organizing strategy for long-term climate resilience. The vision they developed is a full transition of the industrial waterfront into a 21st century climate resilient and sustainable industrial area adapted to climate change. And their vision is not just local, it's regional, national, and international. Our Power Richmond, the community organizing work and multi-stakeholder partnerships in Richmond around the Chevron refinery built enough political will for Richmond to be one of the first cities in the country to include environmental health standards in their general plan, to win historic caps on refinery pollution, and to shift the balance of power on the city council that had been largely influenced by Chevron's political investments. Now they've launched Cooperation Richmond to develop economic alternatives to the fossil fuel industry in the region. And then quickly, Cooperation Jackson, just one of many shining examples across CJA's network of local groups building comprehensive solutions rooted in community power building and a bold vision for community sustainability in Jackson, Mississippi by interrupting extractive economic models and building community capacity to secure essential resources like housing through the kind of economic models that can actually generate community wealth. These are just a few quick snapshots. I think what's so powerful about where CJA is at in its trajectory is having invested in a powerful cross-section of our power communities to demonstrate what's possible at the local level. The Alliance also has a range of movement support organizations that together provide coordinated and synergistic support to new Our Power communities across the country, including a shared just transition framework and strategy, the deep democracy practices of just transition planning, resilience-based organizing, and narrative strategy. We recently piloted the CJA toolset at SWU, which represents this integrated set of capacities. That was training for trainers led by Movement Generation, CJA staff from around the country, and myself. And it was really evident in piloting the toolset at SWU that these capacities are all essential and must work in concert with one another. And it was evident that they need the kind of fertile soil that can only be cultivated by grassroots organizations like SWU that have built deep trust in the community through culturally rooted organizing models and place-based solutions unique to their locality, like the ones that Diana described. And then just in closing, you know, we're dedicated to supporting community-based teams to reclaim planning and transform the culture of planning from top down to community-driven. We provide support through the sharing of community-driven planning tools, approaches, sequencing strategies, ecosystem mapping, forming multi-stakeholder teams, and strategies for effectively intervening on public planning processes to keep them on track towards climate justice. Thank you. I'm really pleased to next introduce William Copeland, a visionary artist, organizer, and the Climate Justice Director at the East Michigan Environmental Action Coalition, EMIAC.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to be here to be a part of this gathering, to work closely with our sister organization, Southwest Workers Union, to follow in the direction of the just transition ecosystem that Rosa just alluded to, and to give some examples of what that looks like in Detroit and how we're building our just transition climate ecosystem in Detroit. So happy to see everybody. Y'all doing all right? Good. Good. I guess I better get this clicker. So I didn't have the ability to bring everybody to Detroit, but we'll go there verbally and symbolically for a little while. So welcome to Detroit for the next 10 minutes. Many people have heard of the Flint water crisis. The Detroit water crisis is less well known to many. In 2017 alone, 1 in 10 homes in the city of Detroit had their water shutoffs in their home. In the last 4 years, over 100,000 plus homes have had water shutoffs in the city of Detroit. Both of these issues relate to emergency management, which is when the state governor directs a representative to take over the power of the municipal powers from elected officials. Many people don't know that there's currently a lawsuit against our current governor, the Republican governor, which points out in this lawsuit that at one point in time, the majority of the state of Michigan's Black citizens were under state control, meaning most of the Black citizens of Michigan were under local representatives who could be removed at will by these emergency managers, who had to get permission to act and make decisions from these emergency managers. And so these governor-appointed people, actually in the case of Flint, that's the person who made the decision to move the water system, was not the Flint local government, but was this emergency manager that had been appointed. And many of us are looking at that and wondering, what are the plans if all of these people are coming from this central person and being appointed throughout these majority Black cities? What is their plan? What are they there to implement? Many activists in Detroit are raising awareness of the health impacts of water shutoffs and also the cumulative impacts of living in what we call sacrifice zones, which have not just one environmental facility, but numerous environmental and polluting facilities, but yet are being, the way they're being regulated, it only regulates them one at a time. And so everything these facilities do is quite legal, but yet the people face the burden of multiple facilities, which are all operating within their allotted permits. Detroit is a city on the move, but EMEAC and others are making sure that families that have been investing in Detroit for decades are not left out. And part of how that looks is self-determination, which is very important in this majority Black city, creative leadership. And these two things, self-determination and creative leadership, are two very important ingredients of our grassroots climate work. EMEAC stands for the East Michigan Environmental Action Council. It was founded in 1971 and was the first environmental health organization in Michigan. It was actually founded in Detroit and moved to the suburbs a few years after that. But in 2006, Diana Copeland brought it back to Detroit and brought about this environmental justice focus, which focuses on the 3 aspects you can see: climate justice, new economy, and leadership development. And as Diana Lopez points out, many of our groups that are grassroots groups doing this policy work have to not only do the policy, but take on the responsibility of developing the leadership so that our people have the capacity to even engage in these policies. And so we have the full spectrum from the beginning to the outputs that we have. Some of the things that I'll say in summary about our work are building spaces for political education and strategy, unique and creative forms of climate justice education, and the way we use just transition as a strategy for both resilience and relationship building, which is so important. And so now for the rest of my presentation, I'll just go over some of the different strategies that we use in our ecosystem and some of the things that make up our just transition ecosystem. First is the Cass Corridor Commons. We own a building in a rapidly gentrifying area of Detroit, which is being forced to make many people feel that they can't afford to be in Detroit and that they are unwelcome and overly policed to be in this area of Detroit. And so we're guaranteeing that this Cass Corridor Commons space is a place where everyday people can not only come and be welcome, but also a place in Detroit for meetings, strategy, and community resilience, which is very important because many times in order to have a political meeting, if it weren't for the Cass Corridor Commons, people would have to meet in a coffee shop or, you know, find some sort of random place anywhere in the world to meet. But this is a place, a safe, secure, and demonstrated place in order to be able to have these kind of conversations that are so important for our movements. Another strategy is cultural organizing. We use this a lot and penetrate this throughout our climate justice education. This includes just a few things of empowering the next generation. As Deanna mentioned, a lot of youth work is done because our communities, we can not only focus on adults, we can not only focus on those of legal voting age, but we have to set the tone already so that young people are prepared to enter into those spaces. Reclaiming public spaces. In the field of gentrification, there are a lot of subtle and not so subtle messages that tell us that this Detroit is not for you. Your people don't belong here. Don't come to this parade. Don't come downtown. Don't go here. Don't go there. And so reclaiming public spaces, as in the outdoor hip hop concert, is very relevant. Political education and new economies. In a very depressed economy such as Detroit, there's always a section of economic work in which people can get stipends, jobs, honorariums, or some combination of the above and combine that into the political work. Speaking of which, one of the strategies that I don't work personally on, but is a very important part of our ecosystem, is the Detroit Community Wealth Fund, which comes out of the work that Climate Justice Alliance is doing with the Reinvest Network. And this is to provide financial resources and bring in more capital, knowing that a lot of places are either not investing in Detroit or not investing in the Black communities of Detroit. And so this is an independent attempt to figure out how to bring capital and financial resources to businesses, cooperatives, and community-based businesses. And especially you can see in the mission in working with historically marginalized communities that may be otherwise excluded. The three aspects are non-extractive loans, that's non-penalizing, non-extractive loans, holistic business support, and democratic control of the loan fund. Secondly, we exist within our region in the Midwest Environmental Justice Network that we're playing a part to add to build up not just the ecosystem of Detroit, but also the entire region. Our regions remain America's hotspot for racialized inequality. When you see these new articles coming out on Facebook talking about the most inequality places in the United States, you may be surprised to see Minnesota and Wisconsin and Michigan very high on the list of racialized inequality. And we recognize that in the Midwest, we have a lot of attention on both of the other coasts, even within our justice movements, but then within the Midwest, there's a lot of attention from mainstream environmental groups. So we had to get together to have a regional, Midwest, and environmental justice network. And three of our goals for the coming year are increasing resources to our region, building policy capacity in our region, and building up the leadership and capacity building in our region. One of the strategies that we use is people's movement assemblies. Communal governance. When governance is denied to Detroiters in official settings, people's movement assemblies is one very important way to keep the practice of governance so that our people don't think that governance is not for us and governance will not be allowed to us. And it also helps to de-silo our movements so that each issue doesn't view itself as a separate, unrelated thing. Many of the people here in this room have been part of our people's movement assemblies, and we hope that that can continue in the future. The last thing that I'll do is an example. We don't have time to get into all of the details about this, but if every city in the United States were to go to 75% recycling rate, the pollution savings throughout the United States would be the equivalent of taking half of America's cars off the road. Furthermore, it would have the effect of creating 1.5 million new union jobs and cooperative jobs. And so we're doing our part in moving and making this transition to zero waste. Detroit has one of the world's most polluting trash incinerators, which for decades has been an impediment to recycling in Detroit, but also it has contributed to rampant asthma. But also, it's a major source of carbon dioxide emissions on par with a coal power plant. And so we're using a variety of the strategies that I've already mentioned, including community organizing, encouraging people to report the facility, which affects its subsidies. They get currently millions of dollars, including renewable energy subsidies, and having people call in gets to affect those subsidies. We also did an energy thing, partnered with CJA through the JPV grant called Making It Ours. We partnered with an organization called Solidarity, looking at what are the effects on energy and waste. How do those two things work together? And next year, we're going to work with SEED, the Center for Energy and Earth Democracy, to do a follow-up on energy and waste. And lastly, we threw down Breathe Free Detroit, which is the name of our campaign, threw down with the Detroit People's Climate March. And we used the Detroit People's Climate March to highlight local climate justice struggles. We knew that a lot of people were going to come in, you know, save the planet, stop global warming, but have no idea on what that looked like in Detroit. And so we alternated the march route. We controlled the opening program. We actually did a program in the park afterwards, and all three of those fit together in order that the hundreds, we had about 800 people who came to the climate march. They would leave not just with an understanding and a passion for stopping climate change, but understanding what are the climate justice struggles in Detroit, of which the incinerator is only one. In conclusion, our takeaways. In Detroit, people talk about the revitalization of Detroit, which has led to a business-centered climate, in which if you are fighting for justice and you are criticizing some of these corporations, you are pushed out to the margins of this particular climate. And so what does movement building look like in this particular climate? And we need the support of a variety of fundraisers and funders and stakeholders to help us deal with this. And that looks like leadership from the grassroots. That looks like advanced relationship building. And I could go into it more, but we love the Just Transition framework because it has some of the world's most advanced relationship building, and it helps stop people from fighting and arguing and all that kind of stuff under the Just Transition framework. And lastly, connecting displacement and environmental justice. If you don't have a community to go back to, then all the solar panels in the world and all the energy efficiency is not going to help you when your community is being displaced. And so that's helping us to reach our communities in new ways and show that environmental justice cares about displacement, and the goal is to get those who are concerned about being displaced to also learn about, care about environmental justice, because it affects our health and well-being as well. And so with that, we say peace, and we say thank you very much.
Thank you, Will. And thank you, Rosa, Diana, Jose. Much appreciate, and I'm honored for this leadership, present here today to give voice, but also vision to what are the pathways to dealing with effective climate strategy. I want to actually reflect on some of what you put on the table, because I think it's important how we think about the way forward, the path forward. And really, it is comes back to listening to all of you. It reminds me that really the most effective way to address this massive intertwined ecological crises is about building powerful movements. And to me, you've outlined what are the steps of building that powerful movement that we need to deliver on the solutions necessary commensurate to the scale of the crises. So reflecting on what Jose started with is really looking to some of the knowledge and wisdom of place-based experience, and the fact that just transition has emerged as this critical discourse between two powerful movements, the environmental justice movement and the labor movement. And they have history, also shared vision, values, and narrative principles that can guide us, that are so relevant today. In this political moment, if we're to build a powerful base that really pushes back against the emergence against right-wing, white supremacist, and extreme conservative, neoconservative tendencies that we're seeing, not just in the US, but around the world, we need to look to reforging those relationships and that discourse. And that leads us to what you announced, Jose, the Jackson Forum in a couple of months, which I believe is going to be a critical place where this nation can look to that discourse between labor leaders and the leaders of community-based movements, EJ movements, really coming together to figure out what is the common vision, values that guide us along four political strategies. One, of building base with shared practices around deepening democracy, guided by principles that allow for our bottom-up politics, that allow all the state and federal policy initiatives to be held accountable to those communities most impacted, but to those democratic principles of organizing that we establish together, that also then root ourselves in real solutions based in communities, community visions, values, but real place-based knowledge of what will work in one community as opposed to another, but then also as guidance points that allow us to really carefully navigate what are the corporate investments, that are coming down, that both techno fixes like geoengineering, biomass burning, clean coal, nuclear power, carbon sequestration, but also market-based solutions that are causing problems, that are overburdening some communities with pollution while letting corporations off the hook in other areas, and stopping those subsidies. Then I really appreciated how, Diana, you followed and really talked about the base building, the organizing moment, because that is so important, both building capacity of our leadership in our communities, but also translating that training and leadership into direct action. And that's where we have a action camp that our organizations, along with 3 of our sister organizations that make up the It Takes Roots formation, Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, the Indigenous Environmental Network, and the Rights to the City Network, all national and international formations, are bringing together our lead organizers for an action camp in March 23rd to the 28th. Currently, we're thinking Houston, Texas. We're really combining the training up of leaders who need to really step up in help in defending their communities, allowing for the communities to come up with the right solutions to both build the new economy, but also defend ourselves against the shocks and slides of the storms and hurricanes that are coming our way in the future. Communities that are rooted in that real life experiences that can best define what are the solutions that we need to mitigate and to provide pathways of resilience in the face of these storms. What Rosa mentioned was really critical about looking to the leadership of communities for place-based knowledge and not relying on top-down models that can be prescriptive, uniform, and one-size-fits-all. And to that degree, we look to many of our indigenous communities for that, the oldest leadership on these lands, that are really have a sense of what are ecological systems and how we need to interface with those ecological systems to come up with the right set of solutions. And our sisters and brothers with the Indigenous Environmental Network are organizing between June 21st and 24th, a gathering called Protecting Mother Earth, hosted by the Nisqually Nation and the Coast Salish Nations, a place that is probably the fulcrum, the most powerful place currently in our fight against the fossil fuel empires. That's where we've been stopping one after another, coal power plants, coal power terminals, oil and gas infrastructure, and really that may be the pivot point for our movements to really build a base rooted in indigenous knowledge that gives us the guidance we need. And then finally, I wanted to mention a gathering that It Takes Roots sister alliances are convening, and a summit of hundreds of frontline community-based organizers from hundreds of communities across this land coming together in San Francisco, September 9th to 12th, to articulate what are the larger set of solutions, not only that embody the vision of a just transition from extreme extractive, dirty energy economies to economies that serve the needs of people and planet, but also how that just pathway intertwines economic solutions, solutions that address the housing crisis, the political crisis around immigration, the crisis around racial profiling and police violence, a crisis that embodies the prison industrial complex, but the multiple intertwined social and economic justice crises that really have to be addressed simultaneous to decarbonizing and detoxifying our economy. And at that assembly, we will be working with our labor brothers and sisters as well, the labor brothers and sisters whom we start talking to in Jackson, to articulate that vision of that path forward, and we invite all of you to join us. I will close by saying at the New York Climate March that our formations organized in New York City in 2014, where we invited the national green organizations and labor to march with us, we were very clear about communicating our message, our shared platform, through how we presented ourselves on the street. And we invited our labor brothers and sisters to march behind frontline communities under a banner of "We can build the new, we can build the new economy." And that's the piece where we are continuing to persist. And I think that should be a focal point of a lot of our efforts in where we throw down and look to pathways forward. So that said, I really wanted to thank everyone again. And now we can, I think, move into Q&A.
Great. This is Diane Ives. I'm the fund advisor on People, Place, and Planet for the Community Fund. I'm sorry, get the microphone.
We have about a little more than 20 minutes for Q&A. We'll, folks in the room, if you want to raise your hand if you have a question. Those of you who are on Zoom, you please use the chat function and type in your questions, and Marian is going to gather them and pass them on to me, and I'll be happy to read them out, and then we'll get answers. And I'm going to just tee up with one question. It's totally not fair that I only get one question because I have pages of notes. But so the one question I would have, I guess I want to really ask Deanna and Will both, like, you talk, I think as funders, oftentimes we hear a lot about those moments when you kind of like work on something critical, like you're working on COP or you're working on a climate action plan or something like that. But what you talked a lot about was the relationship building part of it. And so I would just love to hear from each of you, like one or two key constituencies that you would like to have a better working relationship with, especially around the work on climate action. So who in your communities you feel like you would just like to crack open the door better or have a better working relationship or align better with? And just kind of hear from you on those ideas. And then we'll go around the room here and we'll get some questions from online as well. I'm gonna turn this around.
Yes, I think the two things come to mind. One especially influenced by the work that we're doing this week, and that's with organized labor. Detroit has a long, Nanda alluded to it, but it's very relevant in Detroit also, long history of organized labor. But I think right now at the present moment in 2017, there aren't a lot of partnerships, speaking in Detroit, between the environmental justice and organized labor. And so I would say that that would be one. And then secondly, this is a little bit more abstract, but I think that I would like to increase the partnerships between what I would call organizations such as EMEAC. Detroit has a lot of super duper grassroots organizing, which is super unfunded, but super resilient, super strategic. And then I think that there would be a subset of progressive funders, you know, which would not be all of the funders in the world, but it would be, you know, a subset of progressive funders who would want to enter into those conversations. So I think that that's the second one, is broadening those conversations between certain aspects of Detroit, which are totally out of the loop in the funding section, and certain funders who are looking to push themselves and looking to push their involvement in new ways. And organizations like EMEAC, which serve an anchoring role within the community. So that would be my second.
Right. I think in some of the same ways, I think one of the things that we're facing right now is as a lot of work is happening at the city level with the sustainability plan, climate action plan, all these different hubs. We see that there's a new wave of people who haven't necessarily engaged in environmental justice historically, and who are now part of the table. And so one of the main pieces that we would love to see is, one is, what is the funding that's driving these organizations to all of a sudden be part of this and have funding to hire organizers and talk about it? But two, it's like what is also kind of the honest conversations at the ground level of how do we proceed, and what is the process we should take, both driven by the funders that are funding some of this work, because it's great, you know, funding has been channeled in, but it's not always helpful in that sense. And so developing a process of honest conversation, both with the people who are being funded as well as the funders, and having those deeper conversations where it's up throughout the whole process versus just either at the end or at the beginning, is always helpful. And likewise, who is kind of nuzzled between a community organization and then a traditional labor union. And so we kind of fall in some of those two different spaces. And so some of the deeper conversations is some of the local organizers as well as some of the relationships to the national affiliates is a deeper conversation we would love to hold, and what does it look like for that transition to happen at a different level than what it is at the community level.
Thank you so much. Any questions in the room? Hands up.
Sure. So I'm Samantha Harvey. I'm working with Edge Funders Alliance. And my question is around false solutions. So I think every single one of you mentioned false solutions and then gave some examples from that play out on a local scale. But I'm wondering if, and anyone who wants to could answer, but I'm wondering about the false solutions that are being pushed at the international global scale, like in the COP. And I know the paper just came out on carbon pricing. And I'm wondering if you could talk about a little bit about what those are and how they affect people on the ground.
So thank you, Sam, for that question. False solutions have been around for a long time. I want to just make sure that we got our history correct. And our history dates back to South Central Los Angeles, where the first trading mechanism was put in place around carbon trading. And it was called Reclaim in South Central Los Angeles. So that was literally the place where they learned how to put these things forward, right? And then states were pitted against states. Now we're pitting countries against countries. And ultimately, when we look at the COP, I mean, there were false solutions that borderlined on the ridiculous, right? Where you had some people with big money that invented computers and things, talking about, putting a cloud around the planet so it would reflect sunlight away from the planet. And, it's ridiculous, right? And then you have very calculated processes like RED and RED Plus that target communities that are poor, primarily in the global South, that go into communities, primarily indigenous lands, and start building a process where these lands will become preserves or will be reserved as a carbon sink, right? And people in those lands that have lived there for thousands of years now get booted off those lands, right? Why? Because they don't fit in that new green bubble of what we call false solutions. And as a result, those communities are impacted not only by having to take the global north climate impact, but also by losing land. And you see that on almost every one of the continents where people are having to migrate north. And if you look at the policies around immigration, borders are usually open north to south, but closed south to north. And the migration comes north in many of these places. So again, a lot of these models were developed in communities of color in the United States, and then they were implemented and put forth at a global level now to make money. I mean, why won't I say that? To capitalize on climate, to capitalize on people's air, to capitalize on people's water. So, yes.
Thank you so much. A quick question, not just first, and then if anyone else wants to jump in. There was a question that came in on Zoom about what does the Climate Justice Alliance provide to its members? Is it training? Is it funding? Is it funding and training? So just a little bit of, if you could just articulate kind of specifically, and then if there are examples that any of the folks want to give for their work with CJA, that would be great.
So the Climate Justice Alliance was originally brought together in the lead up to the Copenhagen COP in 2009, when many of us realized that our voices, the voices of frontline communities, were not being represented at the International Climate Conference spaces. And while a frame that we had developed going back in the heydays of the environmental justice movement around climate justice was now being bandied around and oftentimes used parallel to a lot of these what we're calling false solutions or corporate solutions. So the importance of creating a national platform that represented the views from the front lines of the crisis was critical. And that's what we originally organized around. And it took many years of building alignment, building trust, building shared values and principles that are reflected in the just transition principles that we recently came out with and are available for people to look at. A set of common guidelines that are guiding our movements across a very wide, diverse landscape. So we are providing an organizing formation, and we are growing our current membership from currently we have almost 60 frontline base building organizations rooted in communities of color and their alliances, networks, and movement support organizations to looking at going out to hundreds of communities across the landscape with, again, community-based power, a democratic process that allows for a national platform then to be articulated. Aside from this platform, we have also recognized that, for folks in philanthropy who are aware of Sarah Hanson's great report, Cultivating the Grassroots, that highlighted that less than 1% of all philanthropic grant making was going towards those frontline communities in most need. And that a majority of funding was going to large national organizations that were looking at more top-down, beltway and policy-driven proposals or strategies. A part of our strategy has been to really help shift philanthropy's interest and gaze towards the communities that we are accountable to. So rather than, again, creating new models, and that was, Will brought it up, that would move away from even extractive financing models to regenerative financing models, looking at ways in which we could support communities to invest in their own capital in the long term, but looking at ways in which we can create new practices in gifting and grant making that allow for funders to also walk with movements or meet the needs, emergent needs of communities as they arise. So those are some of the ways in which we're looking at providing services to our members and also bridging the dialogue between our members on the grassroots, the world of philanthropy, but also the world of national organizations, unions, the labor movement, and I think that is the most exciting piece. I think that we had a meeting with the AFL-CIO this spring that I'll close on because for the first time in many years, we were called on by the leadership of national labor unions because post-election, they felt very vulnerable. And who did they turn to? The people they realized that they had the most alignment with, a working class alignment. But they realized a decade of trying to organize with national green organizations had failed to come up with any real strategic visionary pathways. So since this spring, we've been having these conversations that has led to the organizing of the Just Transition Forum. But I think that's where building deeper, meaningful relationships amongst our members and these other powerful formations is another key role that we play. Thank you.
Great. No? Anything?
One phrase that hasn't been mentioned yet, in addition to what Ananda says, that we are mentioning it both in our work and in our writings and such, and that's translocal organizing. CJA being a place where we've sent people down to San Antonio. We had people come from Jackson, Mississippi and stay for a few weeks, a few months. We're looking to do even more of that in 2018. It's a place in which we're in different meetings with different organizations. And by hearing their work, hearing their struggles, we've done videos where we've made videos, for example, Puerto Rico was under a financial review board. Detroit was under emergency management review board. So we've made videos, sent those down to Puerto Rico. And so CJA being a place in which as you're hearing of the different things, then you can hear things that resonate, or you can hear things that people are already doing. Maybe they're 3 steps ahead of you, and by you having an email conversation or a visit or whatnot, CJA becomes that place where your learning can be accelerated, and you don't have to figure it all out by yourself, but your organization can figure it out together with the partners of CJA.
That's great. Thank you so much. Other questions in the room?
Hey there. So I just wanted to, I guess, first honor and thank all of you, because I think we always can learn. I feel like I've been in rooms with you so many times, and every time I learn more about the depth of your work. And I think everybody mentioned sort of the ecosystem approach that folks have to this kind of, the kind of work that we know is necessary if we're actually going to make this giant transition and make it just. So I guess the question I would pose is, of the ecosystem and of all the different actions and roles that we know are necessary, what do you think, what would you call on philanthropy to support more? Like, what are the gaps and the particular kinds of actions that y'all are trying to move, but that aren't getting funded?
Thank you for that question, because I think oftentimes we have to figure out how do we get it done. I think similarly we see EMEAC as kind of the in the same situation as we are at SWU in San Antonio. It's like our community is rapidly changing, and how do we maintain that space? And I think that's you know, as a directora, like that's what's always on my mind, is how do we continue to maintain this work? And so a big piece of our just transition work is how do we maintain our programming for long term, and how do we do the work that we need to do, but also be able to fit in the rapid response team, like the things that we know are coming, but make a larger impact than what we plan for, and whatever our the issue is, because we're a multi-issue organization, that's one of the key things, is that our work isn't just one issue. It isn't just climate justice, environmental justice. It's the connection that we have with our workers, with our youth, with the housing issues, with the water issues that we have, that really makes us our work. And so that's one piece of sort of the understanding that it's a larger system that we work on, and that we can't move this piece without moving this other piece, because they affect the same people. And so the building the new, I think is one of those conversations where we'd love to just figure out and strategize around how do we continue to maintain our movements beyond the next 10, 15 years. And how do we use the spaces that we have that are rapidly changing, that are shifting, that are getting old, to really redevelop and revision sort of a headquarters for some of these movements that are really driving on the ground and maintaining and basically their structures of resistance. And so that's for me, that's the one thing that's always on my mind, is like that's never funded, is the capacity building pieces, the ones that isn't tangible, that isn't seen, but that takes years and years of development and one-on-one work to really build a leader to be structured and knowledgeable enough to go in front of City Hall or to go in front of something and someone and say, this is my vision, this is what I want, this is what I need, this is how you get there. Like that takes years and years of just structured conversation and organizing and one-on-one and being out in the streets and getting rained on to really be able to do that work, to have a base of 100, 200, 300 people out in the streets, whatever the issue might be, and being able to respond to that. And so that untangible rapid response relationship building and the building of the like physical spaces, you know, as we speak right now, SWU is under construction and getting a new roof. It's taken us 2 years of just back and forth and negotiations to get to that point. And so now we're at those things of like those things aren't funded unless we go and seek out and have to work with partnerships with the city who don't align on our vision. And so that immediately when you said that, that's the first thing that came. And it's a little bit embarrassing to be like, our office is leaking, but at the same time, it's like that's what's really the structural roots of our organizing is the physical spaces that we do our work in.
So, you know, when you first asked that question, Cheryl, I thought, wow, that's the question of the day. But I think that what we want from foundations is a commitment to the long haul. I think that a lot of the change we're talking about isn't gonna materialize tomorrow, next year. It's a long-term kind of change and process. And I think that what we need is commitment to the long haul. And, you know, general support money is always the best money. Why is it the best money? Because as Diana and others are talking about what they're doing, if new money comes in and it's to do something that takes them away from what they're doing now and they put into a plan for the next 10 years, then that delays that plan even further. So I think it's important for us to make sure that we, that you support, as foundations, support what the ongoing work is, and reach out to organizations and say, what are you doing? You know, bring us up to speed, and look at some of that process and say, I could help you with this, I could help you with that, but here's some general support money that could take you along the way.
Well, and then we're going to ask Rosa to chime in as well.
I really appreciate Deanna used the word headquarters. And I think that from our perspective, it's very valuable and very unfunded. Thinking about 7 years ago, when we were almost totally grant funded, and now our building is about 50% of our income, you know, it's been a major accomplishment, but at the same time, I don't think we've ever got funding like, here's for the building. But yet, if you ask hundreds of Detroiters who will say, we would be very sad if this building closed. The public life of Detroit would be changed. If, you know, it has a political role, but there's nowhere to go where we can say, support us to fulfill that political role. And so oftentimes we end up using organizing money, you know, to pay the lights or to pay repairs or to, you know, to what have you. And so the thing about headquarters is very important. And the thing about the long haul is very important in terms of part of trust in Detroit. Like in Detroit, people like speak their mind. There's a lot of argument. People say Detroiters are very angry and, you know, all of these different types of things. And so part of the reality, and it's not saying that as funders, you need to go and start arguments with other funders, but it is saying, to be able to have a conversation about, you know, we get the progressive side of funding, but there's another side of funding that's not progressive. You know, there's another side of funding that's funding the things that we're dealing with. You know, it's literally, you know, it's adding, here's $1 million, and now the EJ people have to deal with this, you know, and so it's not saying that you need to be out on the street saying the blah, blah, blah foundation is picketing or whatever, but it's to be able to have a conversation, you know, with a funder and say, oh, what do you think? You know, here's a situation about funding, which is negative. How can we talk about that? You know, so that's not even the money. That's just a relationship thing, you know, to be able to feel like I can talk with a funder about this and we're not going to get penalized. You know, we're not going to be like, oh, you know, this EMEAC, they're standing in the way of the foundation, blah, blah, blah. You know, and so I think that's not even about money, but that's the second one from our experience.
That's great. Rosa, do you want to chime in?
Sure, thank you. I would definitely echo everything that Will, Diana, and Jose said, and I wouldn't be able to say it better than that. But I'll just add a couple things. What we see across the board a real lack of investment in community organizing. The community organizing is so critical to being able to move the dial, and that we need to, it's important for funders to see community organizing not just as mobilization around, you know, flashpoint moments, but really that long-term capacity building that Diana was describing. And then the ability of organizations like EMEAC and SWU to serve as anchors in their regions. That requires, you know, the resourcing of their headquarters, their home base, and also their ability to convene their local ecosystem around developing a shared just transition strategy and really developing a docket across multiple organizations that can be funded to move just transitions regionally. And so I think that's really the next where we would like to see the next wave of philanthropy go is to resourcing anchor organizations to be able to facilitate the development of regional strategies and resource multiple partners to be able to play their unique roles in moving just transition strategies. Oh, and I just wanted to also mention that, we mentioned a little bit, but, CJA and partners like Movement Generation and others play a really important role in sort of like developing alternative financing models. And so philanthropy has a really important role to play right now in supporting the development of those resourcing models like revolving loan funds and other forms of next economy models, so that organizations within networks like CJA become self-sustaining and can really regenerate wealth. So I think investment in those models is critical right now.
Great. Rosa, thank you so much. I think we're going to turn it back over to Ananda for a wrap-up. I'm sorry we don't have time for more questions, but this has been really a wonderful follow-up to everybody's presentation.
Excellent. So thank you again to all our amazing leaders and thought leaders and presenters today. And thank you to the Wallace Global Fund for having us here in this beautiful office space, and Diana and Caitlin for being willing to help us tell our story and guide us through the questions, and all of the others who co-sponsored this funding. This is the second in a series of briefings we're providing, the third briefing. The next one is going to be in San Francisco on January 17th, being hosted by the Energy Foundation at their offices in San Francisco. And I won't remember all the co-sponsors, but a lot of our amazing folks like Surdna and Chorus and other funders that I may be missing right now are going to be co-sponsoring that particular event. But that particular briefing is going to focus on what do the community organizing models look like on the ground. How are communities in different parts of the country organizing, much like SUA and EMEAC, but organizing new economies and some of their vision for those new economic pathways. And that'll be a segue to the Just Transition Forum in Jackson. So we're hoping that many more members of philanthropy are able to sign up and join us in Jackson, but also to really start conversations with some of these amazing community leaders and their visions of how we really bail ourselves out of the climate crisis.